Hello and welcome once again to our study of the book of 2 Corinthians. You'll remember the last time we were together, we were looking at the opening verses of chapter 11. And it's a different chapter in comparison with so many things that have gone before. Paul had been challenged by false teachers who actually were false apostles. They were claiming to be apostles, but of course they were not. And so he began with the idea of betrothal. He had betrothed the church at Corinth to Jesus Christ. And his goal was to keep them faithful to their groom. Not married yet, but already committed, already in a covenant relationship. They would ultimately be married to the Lord. And then he went from that and he talked about not being beguiled. You've been betrothed, so don't be beguiled. Don't be led astray. Don't be drawn to unfaithfulness. Instead, remain true to the Lord. That was an emphasis that he had. And then he turned to what we'll just call foolish boasting, because really that's what he called it. He's got to respond to these false apostles. He's got to show the ridiculous nature of what they're having to say. And the best way to do that is to do, in some ways, exactly what they did. But boy, is there a surprise coming. And we're going to get to that, Lord willing, in the remainder of our study today. But before we do that, I hope you'll consider taking a free Bible correspondence course. Listen to this announcement.
Gospel Broadcasting Network offers a free, non-denominational Bible course. It's based strictly on God's Word and not the creeds or traditions of men. Why not contact us for lesson number 1?
Walking in sunlight, sunlight of love, heavenly sunlight, heavenly sunlight.
You may want to enroll by email. The address is info@gbntv.org. To enroll by phone, call us toll-free at 888-805-3390.
So let's go back and look at the boasting. We began to look at it in our previous lesson. Let's pick that up again. We're at verse 22 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. Now he's beginning to list the various things that he went through in his service to Christ. And you think about the things that we're hearing. Stripes, for example. He's going to elaborate on that a little bit as we go on down in this text. In prison, most people, one time in prison would be too much, to be honest about it. And yet he was in prisons more often, as he put it. And so it was a constant thing in his life once he became an apostle. And then more frequently, he discovered himself in deaths often. And that's not in the sense that he literally died, but he was in jeopardy of death. And it happened over and over again in his service to Christ as an apostle. So he continues, from the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. Now 40 stripes minus 1 is an interesting thing that arises from the law. Look to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3 for just a moment, and let's see what was spoken by Moses to the people. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3, he's giving instructions, and as he does that, listen to what he says to them. 40 blows he may give him, and no more, lest he should exceed this and beat him with many blows above these, and your brother be humiliated in your sight. God limited the number of stripes that a Jew could administer or could receive to 40. And in fact, it came to be that if you exceeded that number, that you would be given the exact condemnation that you had just administered to the other individual. So, in an effort to not end up being beaten themselves, those who administered the stripes would deliver 40 minus 1, in other words, 39 stripes. Why? Because they didn't want to get the same treatment. They did not want to be beaten with those many stripes. Then verse 25, he says, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Now, a beating with rods was the Roman form of punishment. And if you think about it, we see that in Acts chapter 16 when the Apostle Paul is at Philippi. And you may remember that while he was at Philippi, that they brought him before the magistrates, and he and Silas were both beaten. Let's look at that very briefly. Verse 22 of Acts 16. Then the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates tore off their clothes and commanded them to be beaten with rods. When they had laid many stripes on them, they threw them into prison, commanding the jailer to keep them securely. Having received such a charge, he put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks. So, Roman beatings, this was in Philippi, that is a Roman colony. Roman beatings were with rods, and there is really no specific limit to those beatings. Paul received 3 of those beatings in his life of service to Christ as an apostle. But then he goes on. Once I was stoned. Now, when was he stoned? Well, he says once, so then that makes us know exactly when he's talking about. Go back to the book of Acts again. This time we want to go to chapter 14. And you may remember he's on the first missionary journey. He's come to the city of Lystra. And when he comes to Lystra, the Jews from other areas came along and actually agitated the multitude. Now, that's not to say that what Paul and Barnabas had done had not already agitated them, because it had to some extent. They thought that Paul and Barnabas were gods, and they tried to worship them, and Paul and Barnabas restrained them. So they were already a little bit agitated. But then we find in verse 19 of Acts chapter 14, then Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So, since Paul says I was stoned one time, we know when that was. Luke tells us about it. It was at Lystra. It was a stoning that resulted from the stimulation from the Jews who had come from other cities and stirred up the crowd against him and against, of course, Barnabas as well, in the city of Lystra. But then he goes on. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I really only know of one time when he was shipwrecked for sure. That's the shipwreck at the end of the book of Acts. He's on his way to Rome, but even though he warned them, we don't need to go any further, it's too late in the season. They tried, they got in the middle of what we call a nor'easter. The old King James has a Euroclydon as its description. And that drove them, literally, they were in the storm for 2 solid weeks. And then they crashed with the bow up against the bar, the rocks, and it was breaking the back end of the ship apart, and they ended up in the water as a result. And so he goes on here, by the way, to say, a night and a day I have been in the deep. I don't know if that's the same event, but it could have been. And if it is, wow, that's a long time to be in the water. Through the night and on into the day, he was in the water. He goes on to say, in journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. Now his list has turned into a rapid succession of perils that he went through. He was in desperate circumstances. Of course, he opens up that verse with, in journeys often, and we know that. If you've read the book of Acts, you see him going from one city to another city to another city, preaching the gospel wherever he can, conveying the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles in an effort to help them find salvation. But then in perils of waters, well, that probably would include the terrible storm that drove the ship, the shipwreck, that's a part of that in perils of waters. In perils of robbers, I doubt that we fully appreciate the way that it would have been then. I mean, now you go down the interstate highway, and yes, you could end up in trouble with a robber, but most of the time you're going along at 55 or 60 or even 70 miles an hour. And so a robber generally is not going to find it easy to access you. In Paul's day, they walked many places. Paul certainly walked a number of places. And as he walked, there would be probably opportunities for robbers to hide behind this object or that object and to jump out and take advantage of them. And Paul says, I was in perils of robbers many times, and also in perils of my own countrymen. To me, as I read Paul, I think one of the saddest things in his life was the fact that the Jews would not listen to him once he converted to Christ. Once he learned the truth that Jesus really was the resurrected Son of God, really from that point forward, the Jews had very little to do with Paul except to agitate him and to try to stop him from preaching the gospel. And literally they did put him in peril. They were the ones that were beating him in Jerusalem. They were the ones that gave testimony against him in Jerusalem. They came to Caesarea and gave testimony against him not once but twice, trying to get him to be sent back to Jerusalem so that they could put him to death. I mean, there literally were people, men, who had taken an oath that they wouldn't eat another bite until they'd killed Paul. And so when he says in perils of his countrymen, I think that is a reasonable description. Then he goes on to say in perils of the Gentiles. Well, of course, you may remember at Ephesus the shouting crowd for 2 hours and how the brethren kept him from going into the amphitheater for fear that he would die. So he was in perils of Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness. His travels, of course, took him to every type of situation, and naturally there would be times when he was in danger. And then in perils of false brethren, folks that claimed to be members of the body of Christ, but they were not faithful in their service, and they caused him to be in danger sometimes for his life. In verse 27 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he then says, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. When you read, for example, what Paul says to the elders from Ephesus in Acts chapter 20, you're impressed with the fact that he worked with his own hands so that he could feed not just himself, but everybody that was with him. And then he preached at every opportunity. So you can imagine he'd be preaching day and night, and he'd have to use his free time to work his craft. He was, after all, a leather worker, sometimes called a tent maker in the book of Acts. He would work that craft so that he could provide for people. So when does a fellow like that get a chance to sleep? And in fact, he says, well, I was in sleeplessness often. It was a regular occurrence in his lifetime. And he was hungry, he was thirsty. We may see a little of that on that boat being driven by the winds, for 2 weeks. It sounds like they didn't have anything to eat. In fact, I know the sailors didn't, because Paul points that out. He says, you need to eat something. You're going to need your strength for what's about to happen. And he already knew about the shipwreck because an angel of the Lord let him know what was coming. In cold and nakedness, you may remember that in the letter to Timothy, the second letter to Timothy, that Paul asked the young preacher to, when you come, bring my cloak. So it was getting late in the year. It was getting cold. Paul needed proper clothing for the winter that was ahead. And thus he even used the word nakedness, probably not in the sense of no clothes at all, but in the sense of being very, very inadequately clothed. All right, verse 28 then, he says, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. I find it remarkable and very instructional to see the Apostle Paul think about all of the various things that he went through, all the pain, all the suffering, all the sorrow. And as he thinks about these things, notice that he says, every day I'm concerned for the churches. Every day I agonize over what's going on with the Christians in various cities. And that seems to be a very accurate depiction. Just about every letter of Paul or from Paul that you'll read, like the Corinthian letters and the letter to the Romans and the letter to the brethren at Philippi and Colossae and Thessalonica, consistently Paul talks about the prayers that he is offering up for them. His concern was constant. It was ongoing for the churches. Excuse me. He goes on to explain, who is weak? And I am not weak. Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? Have you ever stumbled and been embarrassed because of it? I was talking to a fellow just the other day, said he was actually preaching one time in a place that was new to him, and he didn't realize that the steps were set up a little bit differently than they were at home where he preached regularly. And so he got through what he thought was a pretty good sermon, and as they began to sing the invitation song, he started to step down the steps, only he didn't look. He just assumed he knew what the distance was, and he stumbled and fell right out across the floor. What would you do if you did that? If it was me, I can just see the blood just rushing to my face. I would be thoroughly embarrassed. Here's Paul saying that when my brethren are weak, I feel that weakness. And you've been there too, haven't you? You've been there when somebody was sick and you just you felt almost sick for them, as it were. And then he talks about how that if they're made to be embarrassed, that he's embarrassed for them and with them. He really identified with the Christians, and that was a great characteristic of his. It stood out and should have made people know the kind of man he was, and certainly that he was an apostle. So, in verse 30 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he goes on to say, if I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. Paul says, if you're going to make me brag, if you're going to make boasting be a part of this whole measuring, where anybody is, then let me tell you how I'm going to do it. Paul says, I'm going to boast in my weaknesses. Now, in in the next several verses, he's going to explain why that would be so. And we're going to, I think, see something that at least for me, I never would have thought of. But once we've seen it, it'll make perfect sense. And so he says, I'll boast in my weaknesses. And he says, all these things that I've been listing, God knows. He says, he knows I'm not lying. So he basically is calling God as a witness to all the sufferings that he's already listed. And then he says, in Damascus, the governor under Artas, the king, was guarding the city of the Damascenes with a garrison, desiring to arrest me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. Now, of course, that's going all the way back to Acts chapter 9. That is immediately after his conversion that incident takes place. You know, Paul didn't ever do anything half-heartedly. He was a zealous persecutor of the church, but when he was converted, he was a zealous preacher. And I mean, really from the outset, right from the very beginning. So go back there just for a moment or so. Verse 23, he's already been preaching now in Damascus. He's been proving that Jesus is the Christ. And now we find, now after many days were passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket. So now we find that exact thing described by him here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. He said, look, this is how it was. From the very outset, people tried to stop me from preaching. And in some senses, I believe that this entire list is saying, look, you're not the first ones that challenge my apostleship. You're not the first ones that question my teaching. God's my witness. That's been going on my whole life of service, Paul would say. But God has always delivered him, even from the beginning at Damascus, when they were laying in wait for him, they were going to kill him when he exited the city. So then, chapter 12, verse 1 begins this way. It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. Well, visions, some people would say, most often describe or reveal or renew, as it were, people's understanding of something they already knew. Revelations, in contrast, some would say, reveal things that have not been known, the new things that God is making known. So now Paul is turning from boasting about all of these problem areas that he went through, all the danger that he faced, and now he's turned to visions and revelations, what God caused him to know. And he says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body, I do not know, or whether out of the body, I do not know, God knows, such a one was caught up into the third heaven. Well, when is that, first of all? I'm going to suggest to you that when we looked at Lystra, that may very well be the place that we're talking about. And the reason that I say that is because you'll remember that here he says, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. Was he dead or was he alive? Well, you know, we don't really know. Did Jesus raise him from the dead after they stoned him to death? We don't know. And even Paul says he didn't know. So we're not going to speculate on that. But I think this may be the time that he's talking about. Then he says he's caught up into the third heaven. Now, what is the third heaven? Well, let me suggest that the first heaven is where the birds fly. We talk about the birds being in the heavens, but in reality, they're in the atmosphere, just above the earth. The next place that we talk about as a heaven is where the sun, the moon, and stars are. And that would be the second heaven. That's what we now call outer space. And then the third heaven is where God dwells. So, Paul says, I know a man some 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, but God knows, who is caught up into the third heaven. That's where God dwells. Not where the birds fly, not where the sun, moon, and stars are, but where God dwells. That's what he is talking about at this point. So let's go forward and see what else he has to say. And I know such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, how he was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. Now I want you to look again at what we've written down here. The third heaven is now called by a different name. In Jewish writing, it's very common to do what's called parallelism. That is, you say something one time with certain words, and then just to be sure it's understood, you say it a second time, and you may use slightly different words. But the idea is the words are the same. So the third heaven and paradise, according to the way Paul is saying it here, are the same place. He still doesn't know whether this man that he's talking about was dead or alive. That is left to God. But now he goes on. He heard things in paradise that it's not lawful for a man to tell about. In other words, he was given revelations that he couldn't repeat. Now you might ask, why do that? And the only answer I can give that makes any sense to me is that it seems like God understood the discouragement that Paul would face, and he wanted to give him something that would keep him keeping on, so to speak. And maybe that's what it is. But what I do know is you and I will never know what he heard because he didn't write it down. We might find out in eternity, but we're not going to know on this earth. So verse 5 of 2 Corinthians 12, of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast, except in my infirmities. Paul said, I'm not going to brag about that fellow that went to the third heaven, but I will boast in my infirmities. For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool. For I will speak the truth, but I refrain lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me or hears me to be. And so here's Paul laying out exactly the way it is. He said, I'm not going to brag to make you think more of me, except I'm just going to tell you about what I've suffered for Christ. So now we've begun this great thing about visions and revelations. We'll see a little bit more about it, Lord willing, in our next study.
Still be my